Before we continue with the show, a quick word from today's episode partner, UBS. Do you want to grow with your business? Then the UBS Growth Talks may be for you. You will get support from peers and experts in order to take that next big step towards success. And the best thing, it's free of charge. For more information, go to ubs.com/growth-talks.
There's so many things to consider. You need to think about liquidity, proper liquidity plan for that rundown. You need to think about the various creditors you need to serve. You need to pay taxes.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Fabian, a very well welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here, Sylvan.
You're the head of special segments, credit and recovery solutions at UBS. And today we're going to talk about the liquidation of a company. So first things first, what are some common misconceptions that people have about liquidating a company?
Great question to start with. Get the topic right. No, I have three things I think which are misconceptions. The one thing is it's a bad thing. It's a failure, perceived as failure. Second thing, often people think it's kind of an insolvency proceeding. And I think third thing, which is important, is it's not considered as a viable option. And we're going to dive into the questions further, I guess. So, but one thing I want to get right is we have a lot of liquidations, kind of voluntary liquidations, which people are probably not aware of, and they may make very much sense to be pursued, right?
Mm-hmm. So what does that actually mean, liquidation? What does the term mean in the business context?
Yeah, good thing. Let me start with liquidation. There are probably broadly speaking, two different liquidations, right? The one is, and I've tried to kind of allude a little bit to that, is a private or self-initiated liquidation. Mm-hmm. And the other element is more kind of a forced liquidation under an insolvency proceeding. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two, in particular in terms of value preservation. There are material differences. And let me just briefly illustrate it by taking a simple example. For example, the life of a car. As kind of, and don't get me wrong, don't take the life of a car as an illustration of the life of a company, but just to simplify. So the liquidation and the outcomes. So if you think about the life of a car, at the end, if the car gets to the end of its life, you have different options, right? You're either going to sell the car in its entirety for different purpose, different use, different person, different firm in the end, right? If you make the illustration to the liquidation of a company, the second thing is you could break it apart. Different parts. You could sell the different parts for different uses. Like from a company perspective, if you take the same alternative, the same analogy, it's you may sell your patents, for example. You may sell your inventory. So you may break it apart. And the most value destructive alternative is probably just scrap it. So if you kind of make the analogy to the company, right, you probably get the different outcomes of a liquidation.
I also want to deep dive a bit there, the two options that you mentioned. Sure. The first one, the voluntary liquidation, when does that actually make sense? When would you choose that option as a company or as a management team?
Very good question. I think there are a number of reasons that may make sense. If you think about the business model becoming obsolete or no longer valid, right? If you think, let's take an example. It's always the best thing to understand it. If you are a producer of a heating system, right? Or an oil-fired heating system, sorry, to be very precise. In Switzerland, to be even more precise, right? So with the newest regulation or the latest regulation around becoming economically friendly, CO2 emission cuts, so this is no longer possible, right? So your business model has materially changed. You may be able to service these heating systems for quite some time because you can't just get rid of them, right? But it's no longer allowed in Switzerland to put a new oil-based fire heating system into place, right? So this is something where you could think about liquidating your company, meaning like you're part of the business that is related to the machine is probably no longer viable. So you may be able to still sell these machines maybe to a different country where it's still permitted, right? Or it's just no longer possible. And there's still a continuing business, the service business, which you may continue for some time. So you need to plan to kind of downsize and orderly liquidate your company in the end, right? This is, for me, for example, a very valid example where the business model is not anymore valid. You need to think about building a different model, but that's certainly one element.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Another reason could be that you are looking for a successor and you're not able to find one because, I don't know, for whatever reason, there's the only option there is to kind of value preserve, just orderly run down your company. So the same thing as I explained before, but just a different reason. You don't find a successor.
Yeah, two very good examples. Thank you for sharing those.
Thank you.
Then the second option you mentioned is basically the legal obligation where you say, hey, maybe I don't want to, but I have to shut down and liquidate the company. Yeah. What happens there?
Yeah, that is a more formal, I'd say formal process, right? Typically, it's enforced, right, by a creditor, for example. You're not only more able to serve your debt, so it's enforced. The creditor enforces it, and then it's. I don't want to go too deep into the insolvency proceeding, but then you're basically driven by a third party, by an insolvency or by an insolvency administrator in the end, right? Who is kind of controlling the process, making sure that there's an orderly liquidation, that parties are paid according to legal obligations or law. This is kind of and from a value preservation perspective, it's certainly not the best outcome. It's also you need to disclose and make public, or it becomes public. And you can imagine if somebody knows that you're in financial trouble, your assets are going to be valued much lower, right, in the end. So your outcome is going to be much weaker.
So there's most likely that you're going to destroy some value, right?
Absolutely, I would say so. Whenever and I think we're going to get into that, into process, but whenever you are able to kind of plan and orderly and for an orderly liquidation, and there are some prerequisites, we're probably going to get to that. You should go for an orderly liquidation when you have the possibility to do so.
Of course, that's not always the case, but if you have an option to choose from, that's the way to go.
Absolutely, yeah.
So please walk us through that process. How does the orderly liquidation process look like?
Sure. I would break it again into probably two parts. There's a more formal part and a more informal part. And I think we've talked a bit about more informal part. So whenever there are sufficient assets to cover your liabilities, basically, or the creditor claims, I think you can, however you want to liquidate, you can liquidate, right? You can do that step by step. It obviously depends that you have the liquidity to do it and to take your time. But you're pretty free in that. There's a certain, I would say, element, or you're crossing a certain probably milestone when you need to get more formal, which means and there are 7 steps, to broadly speaking. So you have, there needs to be a general assembly that decides on the liquidation or dissolvement of the company in the end. You need a 2/3 majority on that. That's probably not the big topic. You should be aligned at that point in time. Right. Then it needs to be registered, an entry in the commercial register. Then it gets public, so there's a disclosure, and you get basically the entry in liquidation. So your company is in liquidation, which again means you need to think about when is the right time to do that. So then there's some certain legal requirements you need to consider. So you can't do it too late because there's some liability involved, in particular from the board of directors. You need to make sure that if you in particular kind of liquidate the majority or the significant part of your business, I think that at that point in time, that's probably the latest stage where you need to do that formal step. So that there's this disclosure, and we touched on it. There might be some impact on the value preservation. So you probably want to not too early disclose that, or if you do so, you need to very clearly communicate also your rundown process, not to shy away your clients, right? Or and after that it gets more operational. You need to liquidate the assets. Timeline is very different depending on your business, right? What assets you have to liquidate in the end. Once you've liquidated the asset, you need to repay your creditors. If there's anything left, hopefully there is, if you do it properly, you could distribute the rest to your shareholders, the rest is left to the residual value is left to the shareholders. And you may have agreements, we probably touch on that as well, among the shareholders, how you're going to distribute that. And in the end, the company gets deleted in the commercial register. This is kind of the formal steps, very formal, but I think the informal part is even more important than the formal part. I'm not saying informal is less important, but it's the right planning and at the right time kind of initiating the process is crucial.
Yeah, it's really astonishing from my perspective because it's also so much about communication and the right timing, something that you would not necessarily think about by just looking at that topic from the outside. And that's super cool.
Absolutely. And you touch on it with the first question, right? There's this misperception that liquidation is kind of a bad thing, and it's always about, I say failure, it's always about a kind of insolvency. It's not, right? It's a very valid option for certain cases, for certain cases.
Yeah, that's also the art of, hey, the business model does not work anymore, or my business plan didn't work out.
Exactly.
So I'm shutting down in style, so to speak, instead of going insolvent.
Absolutely. And it can even involve a sale in the end, right? So
true, yeah.
You may think in an upside scenario, you think about, a sale to a big investor. Maybe potentially even an IPO. That's probably too early, but that's the upside. Sure. If you think about the downside, you may think like this business option or this business model is not viable for that purpose, but it may be viable for another purpose.
Of course.
But I need a different in the end, a different company who executes on that. So you're going to sell part of it. And in particular, if you're not able to serve all the debt, you may need to find a way through a liquidation process where you bring your creditors on board and find a common agreement.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned those 7 steps. Who is actually involved there? Of course, you as the company's executive team, the board that you also mentioned, the General Assembly. Yeah. But is there any external help that you should get or that you have to get?
Very good point, right? That's I think you mentioned the parties that definitely are involved. So in the end, the strategy and this kind of decisions are at the board level, right? And execution is on the management level or the founders level in the end. And they closely interact. But the important element is, I think, nobody. You may have experts in the board. But certainly, I would assume there's much less experience on the founder side or on the management team, mostly. So I think it's good advice to get external advice at that point in time. There's so many things to consider. You need to think about liquidity, proper liquidity plan for that rundown. You need to think about the various creditors you need to serve. You need to pay taxes. You need to pay all not very high funny things, but you need to consider them. And also you need to make sure that you don't take wrong decisions, which in the end could have implications, in particular on the board who is liable if there's, for example, misuse or misuse of funds, right? If you if you dispose of your assets and then you basically get that money to just one creditor, and in the end it turns out that there's not sufficient proceeds left to pay the other creditors back as well, you may run into big problems in the end, right?
Yeah. And where do you actually find that support? Who can help you with that?
I think you get a lot of support, maybe on the I say on more on the banking community side, like specific teams like we are talking today, right? We are used to that. Like I wouldn't say I would say on a daily basis, but we're not just dealing with liquidations. We're just also accompanying corporates in a difficult situation in the end, and our goal is always to turn it around together with the founder, or just. It's not we turning around, but we kind of helping to giving the necessary support, not only advice, but there are specific advisors there who deal with companies in the distressed environment in the end, right? So, and lawyers, you may need tax advice, you may need legal advice, you may need more kind of corporate advice, right? So there are a number of advisors. I think just make sure that don't shy away from getting support. I think that's crucial.
Fully agree. Now, you also mentioned that the assets, the proceeds are distributed. Yeah. So what actually determines how they are distributed? Because in the end, everybody wants a piece of the cake. How do you distribute that?
Yeah, that's a very valid question. Look, it's, to the extent you are, all the creditor claims are covered, right? You're pretty free how to distribute in the end, right? I think that's not the scenario that probably creates a lot of headache in the end. Often it's getting probably a bit tighter. The fight for distribution starts, right? But if not all creditors are covered, there's a pretty clear kind of structure and ranking according to law, according to in the end to corp law, but in particular insolvency law, right? Mm-hmm. So you may find an outside agreement with creditors, for example, to forgive you some debt, right? Mm-hmm. In order to allow for an orderly liquidation. Yep. But you also, if that is not possible, if you don't find an agreement, you enter into an insolvency proceeding in the end, right? And then there it's pretty clear how the ranking is. It's you have priority claims, priority creditors, which is basically first and second class, and to sum it very briefly up, it's salaries of your employees for 6 months and social security benefits. That's pretty much it. There's something more in there, but I think this is the large part of it.
Right.
And that's also why planning is so important. Just getting back to what I said before, right? You need to plan which people you're going to have on board for the liquidation process. You need to pay them. You need to think about taxes and so on. And then there's a third class, which is pretty much everything else. Mm-hmm. So, and there you need to make sure, and everything else is creditors, not shareholders at that stage, right? Shareholders is always, if anything is left after these classes, that's the residual value, it's left for the shareholders. And I think even within these classes, you need to make sure if you kind of orderly run down the company and kind of dispose of assets, liquidate it, and distribute these proceeds, you need to make sure that you treat, even within the third class, you treat them equally. If you kind of prefer one to the other, it's again gonna create problems. So that's I think the ranking that is there according to law, in particular insolvency law, and you need to adhere to even if you decide, if you're outside of an insolvency process, right? If you don't adhere to it and there's not sufficient, I'm just reiterating my message before. If not sufficient liquidity is left or proceeds to be distributed, you may face, and particularly the board may face liability.
And that can be a real challenge because when you start, you might think, oh, we're good.
Absolutely.
But then further down the process, you realize, we run into a big problem.
Absolutely. I think it's planning and continuous planning and review is so important in these scenarios. And I think that's also the advice you get, I think, from external legal counsel or generally advisors. You need to be very close, and as a board, you have a crucial interest in having a proper planning, being very close in these stages, right? Yeah.
And you also mentioned the shareholders; they come last. However, if you're the founder of the company and you have maybe also investors on board, you're both shareholders, but there might be an additional agreement in place, a liquidation preference agreement.
Yeah.
What can you talk or what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, good question. This is I think it is an important element from a pure liquidation perspective. You could agree anything you want between the shareholders, right? In the end, so whatever is left is going to be distributed according to either your agreement or typically in other countries there may be different shareholder classes like preferential stocks. You can agree. I think what is important, and if I step back out of probably my role and perspective more into kind of an investor's perspective, I think it's important that the founder is driving the business in the end, right? Executing. I think he's certainly also probably some information, better information than the shareholders, the outside shareholders. So I think and that needs to somehow reflect, I think, the ranking as well between the shareholders and the founders in the end, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I would, from a shareholder's perspective more, I would say like it's important to have that ranking in place, which means like the shareholders are going to be before the founders. Mm-hmm. It's also important if you think about the more signaling perspective. If I take now the view of a founder, certainly I don't want to be last in line. I think I understand that, right? But if you think about, you're probably not thinking that much about downside. You need to consider the downside. You're very much thinking about the upside, and you're also responsible for the upside, right? That's why you got investors in the end.
Of course, yeah.
In the downside, if you signal like if you're heavily negotiating on liquidation preferences, my perspective as a shareholder would be like, okay, you're caring that much about the downside scenario. How much do you believe in the upside? That's probably a bit extremely formulated on my side, right? But that's what I believe, like it's a certain signaling effect, and probably that's why I'm saying like this is more a signaling instrument, probably kind of getting the incentive somehow right. It's less of a typical liquidation topic. I would very much look at it from a liquidation. Obviously, it becomes important in a liquidation scenario, but I think that's very important. That's why I would be cautious, and I'm not a founder, right? So don't get me wrong. I want to say what you need to do, but I think it signals a certain message if you're heavily negotiating on a topic which is probably less relevant, and if you think it through, is it that important in that scenario? I don't know, right? But probably I would probably make my point somewhere else if I would be in the shoes of a founder. But again, I'm not a founder, don't get me wrong.
But I think it's a very good point to reflect on, right? Like, what kind of signal am I sending to my potential investors if I negotiate heavily on that topic?
Exactly, yeah.
What we often see is that there's just a 1x liquidation preference for investors. So they first get their money back and afterwards it's equally distributed.
Exactly.
And I think that's a very fair way of going about that.
Absolutely. You're right.
Now, you also mentioned in the intro with the first question that, it's considered as a failure if you have to liquidate your company. So if you actually have to go through that step, maybe that was once your baby in terms of, you had this great idea, now it didn't work out. How do you deal with that on a psychological level? Do you have any tips on that?
Very difficult question, right? And I haven't gone through that, and therefore it's always difficult to give advice. But I believe what I, and also talking to colleagues who've gone through very difficult situations, or at least accompanied difficult situations, my perception is it's very important to stay as rational as possible. And this is I know, don't get me wrong, this is very difficult. I know that's your baby, you've grown up with it, but it's like we've probably look at it with the eyes you look at any other business decision, right? It's how one needs to be rational. And the second advice that is very much connected to that is probably get external advice, get external support. It may be also out of the board, but it may be also entirely independent, right? Get support, and the reason for that is that person, by definition, most likely has a much more rational view on the topic. So it's in some, it's very difficult to understand, right? It's you're very emotionally connected because you've grown up with it. You've invested so much time. You now realize, okay, it's probably going the wrong direction. That's frustrating, right? Emotionally, I can only imagine how severe that is. But I think it is important in your interest to stay as rational as possible and exactly take the decision we've touched on earlier, right? If you need to liquidate the company, it requires proper planning, right? It requires some sort of a rational view on how to further proceed. And I think that's key, and that's the only advice I can give. It's very hard. It's difficult to give advice.
And it's probably also good to not be in this alone. So you have other people around you to support you on this.
Absolutely.
Also from the psychological perspective.
Support and also challenge, right? Get challenged. Challenge yourself. Challenge, but also being challenged, right? On topics,
Absolutely.
on decisions, and in particular in these difficult situations. I think that's key.
Now, one last question in terms of the process. When is the process actually completed? Because there is also a certain time period, right, where potential creditors could still come with potential claims they have.
Yeah, it's so if you probably need to differentiate again between two. Are we talking more about the forced liquidation and insolvency proceeding,
right.
or are we more talking about the private or orderly liquidations? So if you probably deep dive on the second route, or kind of the orderly liquidation, I think once you've served all claims or repaid all creditors and essentially distributed the residual value, it's basically just, and this is very frank, delete the registry in the registry of your company in the commercial register, right? This is the last step in the end. Mm-hmm. And the timing to get there may be very different, right? So it's a question of how long your liquidation process takes. There's a certain minimum period before you kind of can liquidate and also distribute, in particular, before you can distribute, not liquidate, I have to be precise, before you can distribute funds, because you need to, disclose and make public that you are going through a liquidation, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's a certain time period where you need to give creditors the option to at least claim, right?
Right. And
you need to repay them. But there's from a more formal perspective, the last step is if you've repaid everybody, basically, it's a more formal aspect of then deleting the firm in the registry, right?
Perfect. Now, we talked about liquidating our own company, but something that you mentioned to me in the prep call, a very new and super interesting perspective is, hey, what if that happens to one of your key suppliers or partners?
Yeah.
How can you deal with that, and how should you actually also monitor that potential threat or risk?
Yeah. As important as it is for the one that is actually in a position to liquidate the company, it is probably as important as probably a supplier, as you said, to plan, right? And to get information on what's the plan on the liquidation, because that may directly impact you in the end, right? You may, if you understand this is like an orderly, the liquidation is an orderly rundown, you have a time period, the business is continuing as usual, its implications are probably not that severe, right? In the end, you can continue as you did. If you understand that there's liquidity issues on the other side, there's more kind of the process needs to be accelerated. They may even run into a forced liquidation in the end. You may want to consider how you want to deliver. You want to make a change to the payment terms. You may even ask for payment before delivery, so advance payment, right? Mm-hmm. I think that you need to, in the end, it's about getting the necessary information and establish the necessary monitoring. As you said, right? I think it's key to understand what is the process on their side, what are the intentions, how do they affect you. I think that's gonna be key. Absolutely.
And sometimes then, depending on the situation, you also have to act fast to remain in a good or strong position. What does that exactly mean?
Acting fast is what I before tried to touch on a little bit. I think it's acting fast is crucial, right? So first understand and then act on it. And acting fast would be from my perspective, if you just say like, okay, I've seen that this is going to create problems for us. We can't any longer deliver, or we say like, we ask for payment now. We've delivered something. That's payment terms 90 days, 60, 90 days. Yeah. You've now received the message, okay, they are going into a liquidation process. Maybe we need to accelerate, so we ask for that. Maybe it doesn't help because it forces them into going into a forced liquidation, which is probably also not in your interest, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you need to understand, but I think it's once you have the information, you need to properly assess. It's in the end also a risk-return judgment to a certain extent, right? Sure. And then you need to take action on it. And that's acting fast. I don't know, changing your payment terms, probably ask for immediate payment or just depending on the situation, how you understand it, right?
Yeah. And at the same time, this could also be a chance, an opportunity Absolutely. For you. Yeah. You could potentially even buy a patent or buy the whole company if it makes a strategic sense.
Absolutely.
Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, we've seen that if it's a crucial, for example, if it's it's probably more if you look at it. No, it could be both, right? So it's vertical integration, upwards or downwards, for example, right? If it's a supplier who faces that situation, it may be a material supplier for you, right?
Right.
So if that supplier goes bankrupt, it may create significant problems for you. So it may very well be a good decision to integrate that, right? To acquire the company. You may be even able to kind of do it for a very reasonable price, right? But it may very well make sense because you want to ensure your supply in the end. You're able to you have your constant supply in the end, right? So that's an option if you think that's more of going I think upside, right? Mm-hmm. Vertical integration. If you think about downside, yeah, it may also make sense, right? If you have that distributor, for example, who has certain key client connections, right?
Of course.
Absolutely, we've seen that as well. Absolutely.
I think that's quite a twist from the beginning with the first question from it's also negative, it's like a failure, to now, hey, this could actually also be a huge opportunity for your company.
Absolutely.
That's quite a twist that I enjoy.
Absolutely. Me too. And I think it's important to get the misconceptions right, as you said, as we were trying to discuss in the beginning, right? It's not just a bad thing. It may be an opportunity. It just requires, and I think I'm just repeating myself again and again, it requires proper planning, communication, as with everything else as well, where you want to be successful in the end.
Exactly. So I think that's a wrap in terms of the processes on both sides. Do you have any last tips or anything else that you want to add to this conversation?
Not really. I'm really repeating, I think, just key things I said before. It's and just because I think these are the key things, it's about proper planning. Mm-hmm. To ensure success, right? It's and there are various dimensions, and we've discussed this. This is, I think, one of the key things to be successful with an orderly liquidation. I think it's really and the second one I mentioned as well is don't shy away from getting external support. I think this is not the topic that most, and if I remain in more the startup scene, right, most of the founders are aware of. It's something they have something different in mind, and this is right? It's about growing your business. It's not about you shouldn't think about liquidation if you start your business, right? That's a mindset thing in the end. But get external advice because it could also, it's in your interest in the end. It's from a value preservation perspective key.
Really valuable inputs. Thank you so much for sharing those. Before we wrap up the episode, I have some rapid fire questions for you. So I either give you a selection, an option to choose from, or a quick question, and you have to answer in one sentence. You ready?
Good. I'm ready.
How many hours of sleep did you get last night?
I got decent hours of sleep. This is not because of typical founder kind of thing that I work the crazy hours like a founder, but I have little kids. So I'm very pleased that I got a decent amount of sleep.
Well, that's cool. I'm sure that's probably a rare opportunity to enjoy. Liquidating or founding?
founding, because liquidating, I wouldn't say it's my daily job, but it's part of my job. And I just believe founding is kind of a big adventure. I'm familiar with all the stamina it needs, but it sounds, I haven't done it, not like you, but it sounds very adventurous, and definitely founding.
Where do you go to think?
I typically go outside either for a walk or run. It just allows me to, it doesn't create a lot of focus to run, so it allows you to just have your thoughts somewhere else. It's quiet, you're not interrupted.
Perfect. Liquidation preference, yes or no?
A clear yes, because I think it just gets the incentives right, and it's the right signal.
And the last one for you today, Fabian, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self?
I would say try as many things as you can. Try them both in your private life as well as professionally, because you just everything gets a bit more complicated, a bit more difficult the older you get, and not just because of age, but in particular because of probably family life. So try out as many things as you can. I think that's crucial.
I think that's a great way to end today's episode. Thank you so much for your valuable tips, and all the best with whatever you're working on in the future.
Thanks, Silvan. Thanks for having me here. Great pleasure.